I've always loved camping. Not the kind where you park your car at a campsite with toilets and running water. I mean real camping. Middle of nowhere, no cell service, just me, my gear, and the bush. There's something about the isolation that I like. The quiet, the calm, the feeling of being completely on your own. That's why I picked this spot. It was about a 2-hour drive out of town, followed by another hour of hiking up into the mountains. No marked trails, no other people. I'd found it on a map weeks before, scouted it out on satellite images. There was a clearing tucked between 2 ridges with a small creek running nearby. Perfect for a weekend alone. I got there late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The light came down through the trees in long, golden streaks, throwing shadows across the ground. The air smelled like pine and dirt, and the only sounds were birds calling in the distance. It was perfect. I set up camp quickly. Tent in the middle of the clearing, fire pit off to the side. I collected some wood, got a small fire going, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. This was the part one liked most. No rush, no distractions, just sitting there watching the flames. By the time it got dark, the temperature had dropped. I pulled my jacket closer, tossed another log on the fire, and sat there for a while longer. I wasn't tired yet, but I didn't want to stay up too late. Out here, you sleep when it's dark and wake when it's light. That's just how it works. It was around 10 p.m. when I finally crawled into my tent. I zipped it up, got into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I woke up a few hours later and I wasn't sure why. You know that feeling when you wake up for no reason? When you're pulled out of sleep with your heart pounding, but you don't know why. That's what it felt like. I just lay there for a second, staring at the roof of the tent, listening. It was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, too quiet. Out here, the bush never really goes silent. You hear bugs, birds, the wind in the trees. But now there was nothing. Just this thick, heavy silence that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I'd heard something in my sleep. But as I lay there, I started to notice something else. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Not far away. I froze. They were coming from the edge of the clearing. Not crashing through the bush, careful, deliberate steps. The kind where someone is trying not to be heard. I stared at the tent wall, heart pounding, breath coming shallow. I kept telling myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a deer or a wallaby. Something harmless. But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like boots on dry leaves. I reached quietly for my headlamp, clicked it on, and shined the light against the tent wall. No shadows, no movement. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listened. My breathing sounded too loud. My pulse was pounding in my ears. Then they started again, closer this time. I sat up slowly, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and poked my head out. My light swept across the clearing. The fire had burned down to coals, casting a faint red glow on the trees. Nothing. I scanned the tree line, moving the beam slowly. My breath hung in the cold air. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I kept expecting to see someone. A person standing just beyond the trees, watching me, but there was nothing. I stayed like that for a minute, maybe 2, listening, waiting, but all I heard was silence. Eventually, I zipped the tent back up and lay down again. I didn't sleep. An hour passed, maybe more. I just lay there, wide awake, ears straining for any sound. But the footsteps didn't come back. When morning finally came, I got up, unzipped the tent, and stepped out into the clearing. The air was cold and still. The light was soft, filtering through the trees. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking the ground where I thought I heard the footsteps. At first, I didn't see anything. No tracks, no broken branches. But then I found something. About 10 meters from my tent, in the dirt, there were footprints. Bootprints. Big ones. Deep enough to show someone had been standing there for a while. They led from the tree line to the edge of the clearing, then back again. No other tracks. No sign of who left them. I stared at them for a long time, my chest tightening. My first thought was that it had to be someone messing with me. Maybe another camper. Maybe a hunter. But there was no one else out here. I was sure of it. I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't sit by the fire. I just packed up, threw my bag over my shoulder, and started hiking back the way I came. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder. I felt like I was being watched, like whoever left those prints was still out there, hiding in the trees. I made it back to my car, threw my gear in the back, and drove out without looking back. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was someone passing through. But the fact that they never said anything, never made themselves known, just stood there watching, that's what sticks with me the most. And that's why I haven't been camping alone since. We were young, fit, and overconfident. That's the way it is in high school. You think you're invincible until something shakes you. We had planned this camping trip for weeks, hyping it up between classes, telling anyone who would listen how far out we were going. No parents, no cell service, just us and the mountains. It sounded good when we said it, like some epic adventure we could brag about later. We packed light, too light looking back. Snacks, water, a couple of tarps, and cheap tents we'd borrowed from someone's garage. We didn't care. We just wanted to get out there. The hike was longer than we thought, steep in parts with switchbacks that wound up the side of the mountain. By the time we found a flat spot to camp, the sun was already dipping low, washing the trees in orange light. We were exhausted, the kind of tired where you don't even talk much, just set up camp and sit down hard. The trees were tall and thick, branches weaving together to block most of the sky. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, just the distant sound of crickets and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. After we ate, we sat around for a bit, but no one had the energy to keep the fire going. We crashed early, each of us crawling into our tents without saying much. My tent was small, just enough room to stretch out without hitting the walls. I pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin, zipped it tight, and let my body sink into the ground. My legs ached. My shoulders felt heavy. Sleep came fast. I don't know how long I was out before I heard it. A noise, faint, but sharp enough to cut through the haze of sleep. My eyes opened in the dark. My heart was already pounding before I fully registered why. It was the sound of something moving. Crunch, dry leaves, sticks breaking, slow, deliberate steps. I stared up at the ceiling of the tent, every muscle tensed. I listened hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing, just the woods settling, just a branch falling. But it wasn't just one noise. It was another, and another. They were moving. Something, no, more than one something, was moving outside the tent. Not fast, not crashing through the trees. Slow, careful steps, like they were trying to be quiet, like they didn't want to be heard. My mouth went dry. I glanced toward the tent wall closest to me, half expecting to see a shadow move across it. But there was nothing, just the sound. Crunch, pause, crunch. It wasn't just on one side anymore. It was all around. I strained my ears, heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my head. I counted at least 4 or 5 distinct movements, maybe more. The way they moved made my skin crawl, slow steps, pausing between each one, like they were stalking, like they were circling us. I stared at the zipper of my tent door, frozen. My flashlight was next to me, but I didn't want to reach for it. I was afraid any movement would give me away. My breathing felt loud, too loud. I tried to slow it down, but it wasn't working. My mind raced through the possibilities. Animals, but what kind? Deer don't move like that. Not this close. Bears? No, bears crash through the woods. People? That thought made my stomach turn. People. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night, sneaking around someone's campsite? I had to look. I knew I had to look, but every instinct was screaming at me to stay put. If it was people, if it was something worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But I had to. I reached for my flashlight slowly, fingers shaking. The zipper felt loud as I pulled it down inch by inch. The cold night air seeped in, brushing against my skin. I poked my head out. Pitch black. The trees swallowed the moonlight, barely letting anything through. I held the flashlight up, took a deep breath, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the trees in front of me. For a second, I saw nothing but bark and branches. Then something flickered. Eyes, shining eyes, not close to the ground, not small, big, reflective eyes, at least 6 pairs of them. My breath caught in my throat. They stared back at me wide and still. My mind went blank. For a second, I couldn't process what I was seeing. They were at eye level, taller than any animal I'd seen before. Not wolves, not bears, not anything I could name. Just rows of huge, glowing eyes hanging in the dark. I froze. My flashlight shook in my hand. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't flinch. They just watched me. Then one of them turned. The light caught the outline of its body, slender, with long legs. A flash of fur. Another turned. Then another. Deer. A whole herd of them. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. My hands were still shaking, but my heart rate started to slow. They stared for a moment longer, then started to walk. Not away, just past. Slow, graceful steps crunching through the leaves. They moved around the tent, circling us the way they had before. But now that I could see them for what they were, it didn't feel threatening. Just surreal. I watched until the last one disappeared into the dark. The forest was quiet again. Not the heavy, eerie silence from before, just the normal, peaceful quiet of the woods. I zipped the tent back up, lay down, stared at the ceiling. Took me a while to fall asleep. The next morning, we found hoof prints all around the campsite. Trails through the dirt and leaf litter. Deep, heavy tracks. I didn't tell anyone how scared I'd been. I didn't need to, but every time I go camping now, I think about those eyes. And how, for a minute there, I thought they belonged to something else. I wasn't new to camping alone. I liked it, the quiet, the space, the way you could hear your own thoughts without the hum of cars or the endless buzz of conversation. There was something about being out in the bush, away from everything, that made me feel calm, like I could breathe a little easier. This spot wasn't far from where I'd camped before. Secluded enough that I knew I wouldn't run into anyone, but not so deep that I couldn't hike out in an hour or two if I needed to. Typical Aussie bushland, dry, full of gum trees and low scrub, with sticks and leaves thick on the ground. The kind of place where you can hear anything moving around. That's why I picked it. You hear everything out here. Birds, possums, wallabies, even people. Especially people. I got there late in the afternoon. The light was that warm, orange haze you get before sunset, long shadows stretching through the trees. I found a flat spot just off a narrow track, cleared some of the leaf litter, and set up my tent. Nothing fancy, just enough room for me and my gear. I laid out my sleeping bag, checked the zippers, made sure everything was where I wanted it. By the time I had a small fire going, the sun was gone, and the stars were starting to push through the dark. It was quiet, peaceful. You don't realize how loud the city is until you're out somewhere like this. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of something in the bush. Small stuff, harmless. I ate, sat back against a log, and watched the flames for a while. I wasn't in a rush to sleep. When I finally crawled into my tent, it was late, maybe midnight. I zipped up the door, pulled the bag over me, and shut my eyes. I sleep light when I'm out there. You kind of have to. The smallest noises wake you up. A branch snapping, something moving in the leaves. But that night, it wasn't a rustle or a snap that woke me. It was a sound I couldn't place. A single, wet plop. I opened my eyes instantly. The kind of instant where you go from dead asleep to fully awake in 1 second flat. I lay there, heart thumping in my chest, ears straining in the dark. Nothing. No leaves moving. No sticks cracking. No breathing. Just silence. I stayed like that for a minute, 2 minutes. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe a possum knocked something down or something fell out of a tree. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded heavier, denser, plop. That's the only way I could describe it. I unzipped my sleeping bag slowly, sat up, The tent was dark except for the faintest glow from the moon filtering through the fabric. I waited for another noise. Nothing. The bush outside was completely still. I wanted to look, but I also didn't. That feeling, the one where your gut tells you something isn't right, started to creep in. It wasn't fear. Not yet. Just a deep, uneasy feeling sitting heavy in my chest. I grabbed my torch, unzipped the tent door quietly, and leaned out. The second I saw it, my stomach dropped. A kangaroo's head, right there, less than a meter from my tent. It wasn't there when I set up. I would have noticed. You don't miss something like that. The eyes were glassy, half-lidded, staring at nothing. The fur matted with blood, the cut jagged and messy. I felt a cold wave roll through me. My brain scrambled to find an explanation, but there wasn't one. Kangaroos don't just drop dead with their heads off. And even if they did, it wouldn't end up perfectly placed next to my tent in the middle of the night. I scanned the bush with the torch, my hand shaking slightly. The light cut through the trees, bouncing off branches and dry leaves. Nothing. No movement. No sound. And that was the part that scared me the most. The bush is never silent. There's always something. Birds, insects, the rustle of wind in the trees. But right then it was dead quiet, like the whole place was holding its breath. I crouched there for a few seconds, heart pounding. My breathing felt too loud, like whoever or whatever left that there could hear it. I tried to listen for footsteps, for anything, but there was nothing. I zipped the tent back up slowly, like that thin layer of fabric would keep me safe. I sat there in the dark, gripping the torch in one hand and my knife in the other. My chest felt tight. My mouth was dry. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe an hour, maybe two. I kept waiting for another sound, another plop, another rustle, something, but it never came. When the first light started filtering through the trees, I unzipped the tent again. The head was still there, still staring, still bleeding. I packed my gear in under 5 minutes, threw everything in my bag, barely folding it. I didn't care. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. But I never saw anyone. I left the head where it was. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. I hiked out fast, faster than I've ever hiked before. My legs were burning, but I didn't slow down until I was back at the car. When I finally sat in the driver's seat, I locked the doors out of instinct. My hands were shaking. My chest still felt tight. I sat there for a minute, breathing hard, trying to make sense of it. But I couldn't. I never went back to that spot. Never told anyone either. What was I supposed to say? No one would believe it. Maybe I don't even believe it. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever left it there did it on purpose. I wasn't planning to stay out that late. The sun had already dipped behind the mountains by the time I realized how long I'd been on the trail. The air cooled fast, shadows stretching long over the valley floor. I had no cell service, but that was normal out here. That's why I came, to get away from it all. The only problem was I'd cut it close, too close, and now I needed to find a place to sleep. As I made my way back toward the road, I ran into a local guy. He seemed friendly enough, maybe in his late 40s, wearing an old Carhartt jacket and a baseball cap stained with sweat. We talked for a bit, just surface-level stuff. I mentioned I was looking for a place to camp, and he offered to show me a spot. "It's close to the road," he said, "but hidden, right by the river, perfect for a night." I followed him, figuring it'd save me the trouble of searching around in the dark. He wasn't lying, the spot was good. Trees formed a natural wall on 3 sides, with a view of the water through the branches. You could hear it rushing over the rocks, steady and constant. I thanked him and he walked off the way we came. I watched him go until he disappeared into the trees. It felt good to finally set down my pack. I got a fire going quick, cracked open a beer, and leaned back in my camp chair. My buddy had a podcast, comedy stuff, so I threw it on my Bluetooth speaker, let it play loud. I wasn't trying to be subtle. I laughed, drank, watched the flames lick at the wood. Felt safe, open. The kind of place where you don't think about anything creeping up on you. By the time I was ready to crash, it was late enough that setting up a tent felt like too much work. I had my truck parked close, a topper over the bed with my gear stacked up inside. Sleeping there seemed easier, safer too. No thin walls, just metal and glass. I crawled in with my sleeping bag, left the fire burning low, and drifted off. I woke up early, the kind of early where the sun is just barely breaking through the trees, and the world still feels half asleep. My fire pit was cold ash by then. I stretched, got out, cracked another beer, and started breakfast. Just simple stuff, eggs, bacon on a little camp stove. Smelled good. The river kept on rushing like it always had. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of my camp, just barely past the tree line. At first, I thought maybe it was the guy from last night. But as I squinted, it was clear this wasn't him. This guy looked rough, dirty clothes with plastic grocery bags tied all over him, hanging off his arms and legs like streamers. His beard was long and tangled. He looked homeless, but not quite. There was something off. I raised my hand. "Hey man, nice morning." Nothing. He didn't move, didn't even look at me, just sort of lingered there, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His eyes were somewhere else. I felt the back of my neck prickle. It wasn't fear yet, but something close. I offered him breakfast. Nothing. Not a word. He started pacing slowly, never coming closer, just tracing a wide loop around my camp. His feet crunched softly in the dead leaves. I held my beer in one hand, the spatula in the other, and watched him move. "Want a beer?" I called. My voice was steady, but inside I could feel something knotting up. He stopped for a second, turned his back to me, then kept pacing. That's when it hit me, he wasn't here to talk. He wasn't lost. He wasn't hungry. He was just watching. Or worse, maybe he had been watching all night. I glanced down at my gear. My bear spray and buck knife were right where I left them, just within reach. I set the spatula down slowly, wiped my hands on my jeans, cleared my throat. "Hey, you're either gonna acknowledge me, or you're gonna leave." My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. The air felt heavier by the second. He didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. Just this slow, lazy shuffle around the edges of my camp, eyes somewhere else, like I wasn't even there. I picked up the bear spray and took a few steps toward him. I wasn't bluffing. I wanted him gone. Something changed then. His shoulders slumped a little more, like he was sulking. He turned slowly, walking back into the trees the same way he'd come. Not a word, not a glance. I stood there for a second, heart pounding. I could still hear the river. The morning was still cool. The air smelled like smoke and bacon grease, but nothing felt right anymore. I packed my stuff fast, threw it in the back of the truck in no particular order. I kept glancing over my shoulder the whole time, half expecting to see him standing there again. When I finally got in the driver's seat and locked the doors, I sat there for a minute, breathing. The fire pit was still smoking a little. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. It all looked the same, but I felt different. I drove out of there quick. It wasn't until I was halfway back to town that I realized my hands were still shaking. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe nothing, maybe something worse, but I'm glad I slept in my truck. I've always liked camping, not in the popular, crowded campgrounds where you can hear the family next to you arguing over how to pitch a tent. I mean real camping, deep in the woods where it's just you, the trees, and the sound of nothing. There's something calming about it. No traffic, no emails, no people. I needed that break. Work had been eating me alive, and I figured a weekend away would clear my head. I picked a spot I'd been to a couple of times before, about 15 miles from the nearest trailhead. No cell service, no other campers. That was the point. I loaded up my pack, drove out Friday morning, and started hiking. The weather was perfect. Clear sky, warm enough during the day to be comfortable, with that crisp chill in the evening that makes a campfire feel like heaven. The hike took about 5 hours. By the time I found a flat spot near the base of a ridge, I was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that makes you feel like you've earned your rest. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for the fire and ate dinner while the sun dipped behind the trees. The woods got dark fast. That first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire for a while, staring at the flames until my eyes were heavy. The woods were quiet except for the usual sounds: crickets, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the brush. I slept like a rock. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it hiking around, taking my time exploring the ridge. No rush, no schedule. By late afternoon, I made it back to camp, cooked some food, and sat by the fire again. Everything felt normal. I remember thinking how nice it was to finally get away from everything. But that night was different. It started with the feeling. I don't know how to describe it. Just that low, nagging sense that something wasn't right. Like being watched even though there was no one around. I told myself it was in my head. I've camped alone 100 times. You get used to the quiet. Sometimes it makes you paranoid. I stayed up later than usual, poking at the fire, listening to the woods. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Too quiet. No crickets. No rustling in the brush. Just the crackle of the fire and the sound of my own breathing. I thought maybe there was a predator nearby, a coyote or a bear, but I hadn't seen any signs of that all day. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. I put the fire out, crawled into my tent, and tried to sleep. But I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the dark, heart beating harder than it should have been. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not close, not loud, but steady, slow, coming from the trees behind my tent. I froze. My mind started running through possibilities. A deer, maybe, or a big raccoon. But the longer I listened, the more certain I was that it wasn't an animal. These footsteps were heavy, slow, 2 feet, someone walking. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding. I kept telling myself that no one else should be out here. This place was too remote. And who hikes out to the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night? The footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing. I sat up as quietly as I could, unzipped the tent a few inches, and peeked out. My fire was dead, but the moon was bright enough to cast a pale light over the trees. I didn't see anything. No movement. No shadows. I sat there for a while, staring into the woods, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer after all. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. My food bag was hanging from a tree branch about 20 feet away. Standard practice to keep animals out. I could barely see it in the dark, but it was swinging, gently, like someone had just brushed past it. I crawled out of the tent, grabbed my flashlight, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the dark. I scanned the trees. No one. I walked over to the food bag. It was still swinging slightly, creaking on the rope. My stomach knotted up. I circled the camp, shining the light into the woods, looking for any sign that someone had been there. Footprints, broken branches, anything. But there was nothing, just trees and dirt. I went back to the tent, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there listening. Every little noise made my heart jump. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted. But I told myself it was fine. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was an animal. I spent most of the next day trying to shake the feeling. I went for another hike, stayed busy, but something just felt off. I kept thinking about those footsteps, the way they stopped when I noticed them, the way the food bag was moving. It didn't make sense. By the time the sun started going down, I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up most of my gear, leaving just enough out for the night. I figured I'd sleep a few hours and head back at first light. But I didn't make it through the night. I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was outside the tent. Slow, deep. I could hear it over the pounding in my chest. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle locked up. My brain was screaming at me to do something. Grab the flashlight, make a noise, anything, but I couldn't move. The breathing kept going. Slow, steady, calm. Then the zipper on my tent moved. Not fast. Not like someone trying to get in, just a slow tug like they were testing it, seeing if it was locked. I bolted. I didn't even think. I grabbed the knife I keep by my sleeping bag and ripped the zipper open on the other side, scrambling out into the dark. I shined my flashlight toward the tent. No one. My chest was heaving. I spun in circles, light shaking in my hands. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. But I swear I could still hear breathing, just beyond the trees. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my pack, left the tent behind, and started hiking. I don't even remember how long I walked. I just kept going, legs burning, heart pounding, until the sky started to lighten with dawn. When I finally made it back to my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I sat there, shaking, staring at the tree line, expecting to see someone watching me. But there was nothing. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just some stranger messing with me. Maybe it was something worse. I never went back to find out, and I never camp alone anymore. I'm not sure why I'm even writing this. Maybe because I still can't make sense of it. Maybe because when something like this happens, it sticks with you, gets under your skin in a way that nothing else ever has. I haven't been back to the woods since that night. I don't think I ever will. I've been camping for years. I'm not an expert, but I know my way around the woods. I know how to build a fire, navigate without a phone, keep my food out of reach of bears. I like camping alone, or I used to. Being out there by yourself is peaceful, at least it was, until that night. It was late September when I drove out to Black Hollow. It's a spot way off the beaten path, deep in the woods where nobody goes unless they know about it. No marked trails, no campsites. I'd been there a few times before. It's quiet, remote. That's what I wanted, a weekend away from everything. I parked where the logging road ends and hiked about 6 miles into the woods. The trees out there are tall and old, and the ground is thick with pine needles. By the time I found a good spot near the base of a hill, the sun was low. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. It was one of those calm, still evenings where the air feels heavy. The woods were quiet, except for the crackle of the fire. I remember sitting there, watching the flames, thinking about how perfect it was. I was tired from the hike, but it felt good. I ate dinner, stared at the fire until it burned down to embers, and finally crawled into my tent around 11. I fell asleep almost immediately. It was the sound of sticks breaking that woke me up. I opened my eyes, heart already pounding. It wasn't the kind of noise you hear when an animal is moving around. It was slow, steady, like footsteps. I checked my watch, 2:14 a.m. I lay there for a minute, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or something small moving through the brush. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. I just kept staring at the ceiling of my tent, ears straining. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Crunch, pause, crunch. My chest tightened. It was coming from the direction of the ridge. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I reached for my flashlight, but something in my gut told me not to turn it on. I just sat there, barely breathing. The footsteps kept getting closer, not rushing, just steady, slow steps. I unzipped the tent an inch and peeked out. The moon was out, lighting up the trees enough to see shadows, but I didn't see anyone. Then I caught movement. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a pale shape moving slowly through the trees. But as it got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman. She was walking slowly, barefoot, wearing a long, dirty shirt that hung down to her knees. Her hair was tangled and dark, and her arms hung limp at her sides. She wasn't looking around, just walking. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe she was lost. Maybe she was hurt. But something about the way she was moving made my skin crawl. There was no urgency, no confusion, just slow, steady steps. She walked right past my tent, no more than 20 feet away. I held my breath, heart pounding so hard I thought she'd hear it. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anything, just kept walking, slowly disappearing into the trees. I waited until I couldn't hear her footsteps anymore. My hands were shaking. I kept telling myself I should check on her, but I couldn't make myself move. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting up in my sleeping bag with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. The woods stayed quiet. I told myself maybe it was some local, maybe she was camping nearby, maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. By morning, it felt like a bad dream. I packed up my gear fast. I didn't want to stay another night. As I was loading up my pack, I noticed something on the ground near where she had walked. Bare footprints. They were small, thin, and they weren't going in the direction I'd seen her walking. They circled my tent. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself I was wrong. Maybe I'd missed them when I set up camp, but I knew I hadn't. I took a picture with my phone, just to prove to myself they were real. The hike back to my car felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a branch made me flinch. I kept checking over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. I thought it was over, but when I got back to my car, there was something stuck under the windshield wiper. A piece of dirty cloth. It looked like it had been ripped from an old shirt. I left it there, drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got back, I checked the picture on my phone. The footprints were there, clear as day. I tried to show it to a friend a few days later, but when I opened the gallery, the picture was gone. I don't know how. I didn't delete it. I still don't know who she was or what she was doing out there, but I can't stop thinking about the way she walked. Like she knew exactly where she was going, and like she wasn't in a hurry to get there. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't think I ever will. I've always been the kind of person who likes to be alone. I don't hate people or anything. I just function better on my own. I think that's why I fell in love with camping, real camping, not the kind where you park an RV in a crowded campground with picnic tables and toilets. I mean hiking miles into the woods, pitching a tent where there's no one for miles. Clears my head. At least it used to. This happened 2 years ago, and I haven't been camping since. I probably never will again. No one believes me when I talk about it. I don't blame them. If I hadn't been there, I wouldn't believe me either. It was early October, just as the leaves were starting to turn. The weather was perfect, cool enough to need a jacket at night, but warm enough during the day to hike comfortably. I had a 3-day weekend and planned to spend it at Breaker's Hollow, a spot deep in the woods where hardly anyone goes. It's remote, about 12 miles from the nearest trailhead. There's no cell service, no marked trails, just thick trees and a narrow river that winds through the valley. I'd camped there a few times before, and I'd never seen another person out there. That's why I liked it. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, food for a couple of days, a good knife, flashlight, and my water filter. I started hiking early Friday morning. The trail was quiet, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt, the occasional call of a bird overhead. The deeper I went into the woods, the better I felt. By the time I reached the spot where I usually camped, a flat clearing near the river, it was late afternoon. The place looked exactly how I remembered it. Tall pines circled the clearing, and the river was low enough to wade into if I wanted to. I set up my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked dinner as the sun dipped below the trees. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire for a while, staring at the flames until my eyes got heavy. The woods were quiet except for the rushing of the river and the occasional rustle of something small moving in the brush. I crawled into my tent around midnight and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't hear anything unusual. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were completely silent. Too silent. If you've spent enough time in the woods, you get a feel for what's normal. There's always some noise, crickets, owls, something moving in the brush. But this wasn't normal. It was dead quiet. I sat up in my tent, trying to listen over the sound of my own breathing. That's when I noticed it. A smell. It was faint, but it was there. Something metallic, sharp, like blood. I thought maybe an animal had died nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to look out. The beam cut through the dark, bouncing off the trees. Nothing. I waited for a few minutes, heart pounding. I didn't hear anything. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and tried to sleep. The next day was uneventful. I spent most of it hiking along the river, enjoying the quiet. The woods felt normal again. The silence from the night before felt like a bad dream. By the time I got back to camp, I was tired but relaxed. I cooked dinner, watched the sunset, and let the fire burn down low. I almost packed up that night. Something in my gut was telling me to leave, but I ignored it. I wish I hadn't. I woke up again around 3 a.m. this time. Same thing. My heart was racing before I was fully awake. The woods were dead silent again. I lay there in my sleeping bag, straining to hear something, anything. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not something running through the brush. Slow, steady footsteps, coming from the trees behind my tent. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities. A hiker? A hunter? But no one came out this far. And why would they be walking through the woods in the middle of the night without a flashlight? I reached for my knife. My hand was shaking. I waited, barely breathing, as the footsteps got closer. Then they stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense. I kept waiting for something to happen, for someone to speak, for the footsteps to start again. But there was nothing, just silence. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent and peek out. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. I swept the flashlight beam over the trees, and that's when I saw her. She was standing about 30 feet away, just at the edge of the trees. A woman, middle-aged, maybe wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Her hair was messy, hanging in her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. My heart nearly stopped. I called out, but she didn't answer. She didn't even flinch, just kept standing there. I don't know how long we stared at each other. Eventually, I grabbed my pack, shoved my gear into it as fast as I could, and started backing away. I kept the flashlight on her the whole time, but she never moved, not once. I hiked back to the car that night, 12 miles in the dark with nothing but a flashlight. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me. I kept checking over my shoulder. When I finally made it back to the car, the sun was just starting to rise. I threw my pack in the back seat and drove as fast as I could down that old logging road. It wasn't until I stopped for gas an hour later that I noticed the handprint. There was a single, dark handprint on the back window of my car. Smudged, small, too small to be mine. I don't know who she was. I don't know why she was out there. But I know this, she wasn't lost. She wasn't confused. She was watching me, and I think she still is. I've been camping for most of my life. Not the kind of camping where you pull up to a crowded campsite with running water and RV hookups. I mean the real stuff. The kind where you carry everything on your back, hike miles into the woods, and sleep where nobody can find you. It's the only place I've ever really felt calm. When I'm out there, with nothing but trees and the sound of the wind, everything feels simple. It's where I go to clear my head. But I haven't been back since last summer. I'm not sure if I ever will. I planned the trip like I always do. 3 days solo somewhere deep. This time it was the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. A place big enough to get lost in for days if you're not careful. I'd been there before, but this time I wanted to try a new spot. A place a buddy of mine told me about. He said there was this clearing by a creek about 10 miles off the main trail. No campsites, no other hikers. Perfect. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a knife, water filter, flashlight, the basics. I hit the trail early, figuring I'd make camp by mid-afternoon. It was hot for August. The air hung heavy, thick with humidity, and the bugs were relentless. By the time I reached the clearing, my shirt was soaked through. The spot was just like my friend said. Wide, flat ground near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by tall pines. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, and filtered some water from the creek. Everything felt normal, peaceful. I spent the evening cooking over the fire, staring up at the sky as the sun went down. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent. I always sleep lightly when I'm out there. Not because I'm scared, just because the woods are full of sounds. You learn to tune most of it out. The rustle of small animals, the creak of the trees. It all blends together. But something woke me up around 2 a.m. A sound that didn't blend. It was faint at first, a rustling in the brush. Something moving, slow and steady. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. I tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard the breathing. Deep, slow, heavy. It was close, maybe 10 feet from my tent. My heart started pounding. I reached for my flashlight and sat up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I flicked it on and aimed the beam through the thin fabric of the tent. Something moved. I unzipped the tent just enough to look out. The fire had burned down to embers, but there was enough moonlight to see. That's when I saw it. A dog. It was standing just at the edge of the clearing, half in shadow. Big, maybe a German Shepherd mix, but bigger than any dog I'd seen before. Its fur was matted and dark, almost black. I could see its ribs poking through its sides like it hadn't eaten in weeks. I exhaled, trying to calm down. Stray dog, I thought. Maybe someone's pet that got lost. I shined the flashlight toward it, hoping to scare it off. It didn't move. That's when I noticed its eyes. They weren't glowing or any of that nonsense. They were just off, too wide, unblinking. It stared at me like it wasn't scared, like it wasn't curious, just watching. I shouted, waving my flashlight. Nothing. Then, without making a sound, it turned and walked back into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in my tent with the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. Every little sound set me on edge, but I never heard it again. By morning, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. Maybe it was sick. Maybe it was just lost. I packed up and decided to stay one more night before hiking back. I moved my camp about a mile upstream, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever that thing was. The second day felt normal. I spent it fishing, hiking along the creek. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I kept telling myself I was just paranoid. I'd see something moving in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing. That night, I built the fire higher, kept it burning longer. I told myself it was just to keep the bugs away, but I knew that wasn't true. Around midnight, I heard it again. The breathing, slow, heavy, right on the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath. Then I saw it. The dog. Closer this time, maybe 20 feet away. It was sitting this time just outside the firelight. Its head was low, its ribs rising and falling with each slow breath. Its fur looked even worse now, patchy, dirty. But it was the way it was looking at me that made my skin crawl. It wasn't scared. It wasn't curious. It looked calm, like it had all the time in the world. I threw a rock. It didn't flinch. I backed toward my tent, heart hammering. I could feel its eyes on me the whole time. I zipped the tent shut, but I knew that wouldn't stop it if it wanted to get in. Then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate. It was circling my tent. I could hear its breathing the whole time, deep and steady, like it wasn't in any rush. I sat there with my knife in my hand, every muscle in my body tense. I waited for it to lunge, for it to claw at the tent, but it didn't. It just kept circling, over and over, for hours. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, it was morning. I crawled out of the tent, heart pounding. The clearing was empty, but the dirt around my tent was covered in paw prints. Too many paw prints. I packed up and hiked back that morning. Fast. I kept checking over my shoulder the whole way. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I could swear I heard something moving in the distance. I never saw it again, but when I got back to my car, there were fresh paw prints in the dirt behind it. It had followed me, and I don't think it ever stopped. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. I guess I never really believed in that whole fight or flight thing. I'm more of a close your eyes and pretend it's not happening kind of guy. That's probably why I reacted the way I did that night. I keep telling myself that if I'd stayed awake, if I'd done something, maybe it wouldn't still bother me. But it does. This happened last summer when I went camping with my roommates. Mike and Ryan. It was Mike's idea. He was always dragging us off to do stuff like that. Hiking, climbing, anything that made me sweat or left me covered in bug bites. I didn't complain too much, though. It was usually fun once we got there. We found this campsite online, way out in the woods about an hour from town. No camp host, no nearby campers. Just a flat stretch of dirt near a creek with a fire pit someone had built out of rocks. We had to drive down this old logging road to get there, the kind that makes your suspension creak like it's begging for mercy. By the time we parked, the sun was starting to set, and we had to hustle to get the tent up before dark. The tent was a beast, one of those 6-person things that barely fits back in the bag once you take it out. We got it pitched just as the last light faded and started a fire while Ryan cracked a couple of beers. The woods were quiet except for the sound of the creek and the occasional chirp of insects. The kind of quiet that feels nice when you're with friends. We hung out for a few hours talking about nothing, throwing sticks into the fire. Normal camping stuff. There was this peacefulness in the air, like the world had slowed down. Felt good. We were laughing, relaxed. No one said it out loud, but we all knew part of the fun was being so far from anyone else. We finally called it a night sometime after midnight. We piled into the tent, laying our sleeping bags side by side in the cramped space. I remember lying on my back, staring at the nylon ceiling while the others mumbled a few last jokes before drifting off. And then, a few hours later, I woke up. It was the kind of waking up where you're not sure what pulled you out of sleep. My eyes opened slowly, my mind foggy. I blinked at the dim fabric of the tent and listened. For a second, I thought it was nothing. Then I heard it, scratching, not loud, soft, like someone running their fingers along the side of the tent. My heart started pounding immediately. I lay completely still, staring at the dark ceiling. The sound moved slowly, from one corner of the tent to the next, slow and steady. I could hear the nylon rustling, the faint scrape of nails or fingertips dragging against the fabric. I glanced at Mike and Ryan. Even in the dark, I could tell they were awake. I could see the outline of Mike's face, the wide-eyed look of someone who was trying very hard not to move. Ryan was breathing shallowly, chest rising and falling like he was trying to stay quiet. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a stray dog, but the way it moved didn't feel right. It was too steady, too slow, like it was walking, deliberately tracing the edge of the tent. I shut my eyes. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to see their faces, or maybe because I thought if I pretended it wasn't happening, it would stop. I could still hear it, the slow, deliberate scratching circling the tent. Every few seconds, it would pause. Then it would start again from another side. I thought about sitting up, thought about grabbing the flashlight, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that if I made a scene, I'd look like an idiot. I figured if I just went back to sleep, it'd be over in the morning. So I did. I rolled over in my sleeping bag, pulled it up to my chin, and let myself drift back to sleep. I could still hear the scratching as I faded out. When I woke up, it was morning. The tent was filled with soft, pale sunlight, and for a second, everything felt normal. I stretched, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, until I saw Mike sitting up. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. Ryan was sitting next to him, staring at the ground. I could tell they had both been waiting for me to wake up. We didn't say anything. None of us wanted to be the first to admit it, but the tension in the tent was thick. I grabbed my boots and stepped outside to get some air. That's when I saw the footprints. They circled the entire tent. Not animal prints. Shoes, barely pressed into the dirt. The kind you'd miss if you weren't looking for them. But once you noticed them, it was impossible to unsee them. They looped around the tent over and over, stopping at random spots. The worst part was the size. They weren't big. They were small, like a kid's. I called Mike and Ryan over without saying anything. They saw them too. Nobody spoke for a long time. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I kept telling myself it didn't make sense. We were miles off the road. No other campsites nearby. We hadn't heard anyone walking. No cars, no voices. We packed up fast. Faster than I've ever packed up a tent in my life. We threw our stuff in the back of Mike's car and drove out of there without saying much. It wasn't until we got back to town that anyone brought it up. I wanted to believe it was a prank, maybe another group messing with us. But who hikes miles into the woods just to walk circles around a random tent in the middle of the night without saying anything? And how come none of us heard them actually walking? I keep replaying it in my head. The scratching, the slow, steady way it moved. I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened my eyes, if I'd unzipped the tent. I tell myself I'm glad I didn't, but part of me still wonders. I've always enjoyed getting away from the world, especially when things get too overwhelming. Something about the solitude, the stillness of nature, made everything else seem insignificant. That's why I decided to take this camping trip on my own. No distractions, no noise, just the woods, a tent, and me. I'd been to this spot before, though not for several years. It's an isolated patch of forest tucked away in the mountains, far enough from civilization that there's no cell service. No towns, no roads, just trees. Lots of trees. It was perfect for what I wanted. Some peace, some quiet, and a chance to clear my head. The hike up to the site was grueling, but nothing I couldn't handle. The path was narrow, tangled with roots and rocks, making it easy to lose your footing if you weren't careful. I had to stop a few times to catch my breath and drink some water, but eventually, I made it. The clearing was just how I remembered it. A small area with a patch of soft grass and a creek that ran nearby. The trees on all sides gave the area a sense of enclosure, as though the woods were protecting it from the outside world. I set up camp as quickly as I could, getting my tent up and securing my gear. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountain, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. I knew it would be dark soon, and I wasn't keen on being caught out here without a fire. I gathered some dry wood, lit it, and watched as the flames flickered to life, warming the chilly evening air. By the time the fire was blazing and I had dinner cooking, it was fully dark. The night sounds of the forest slowly started to rise. The distant calls of owls, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Nothing unusual, just the usual noises of the woods. I ate my meal by the fire, enjoying the solitude. There was something calming about being out here by myself, something that made everything else fade into the background. It wasn't until later, after I had finished eating and was sitting back in my camp chair, staring into the flames, that I began to notice how still the forest had become. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the effects of being out here alone for too long. The night felt almost unnaturally quiet, like the forest had paused to hold its breath. But then I heard it, a rustling. It wasn't much, just a faint sound, like something moving through the leaves just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, I figured it was some animal, maybe a deer or a rabbit, but as I listened more closely, the sound didn't seem like the movements of an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. My heartbeat quickened. The fire crackled, but its warmth didn't reach me anymore. I felt the cold air brush my skin. I stared into the darkness, trying to make out any shapes, any movement. The rustling stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. But the forest remained eerily silent again. A few minutes passed, and I was starting to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. The sound was probably just some leaves shifting in the wind or the natural noises of the woods. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer. I could feel my pulse rising. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to overreact, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence, the stillness. It was the way the noises came in waves. One rustle, then a pause, and then another rustle closer than before. It felt almost like something was circling the camp, watching. I grabbed my flashlight from beside me, shining it around the perimeter of the camp. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating trees, rocks, and the grass. Nothing, but the rustling continued. It wasn't the sound of wind or animals. This was the sound of something moving purposefully. At that point, my mind was racing, trying to piece things together. I didn't want to believe it, but my instincts were telling me something wasn't right. I stood up slowly, keeping the flashlight in my hand. My gaze darted between the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the presence of something or someone out there. I moved to the edge of the camp, stepping lightly over the dry leaves. The fire behind me flickered and crackled, casting shadows that danced across the clearing. My heart thudded in my chest. I felt a strange sense of dread, like I was about to step into something unknown. Then I saw it, a shape moving just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, too tall for a typical animal. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, but then the shape moved again, more deliberately this time. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a person. I froze, too scared to move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It wasn't close enough to see clearly, but the outline was unmistakable. Someone was out there. The figure didn't move toward me. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, barely visible through the trees, watching. A wave of terror hit me, and my thoughts went wild. Who was out there? What did they want? Should I yell for help? But I was alone, and there was no one around for miles. I was out here, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a flashlight and a fire to protect me. I reached for my bear spray, my hand trembling. The figure remained motionless, barely even breathing. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, like they were studying me, waiting for something. My thoughts raced, wondering if I should stay quiet, if I should confront them, or if I should just get the hell out of there. And then, without warning, the figure moved. Not toward me, but away, disappearing into the woods as silently as it had come. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gear, shoved everything into my pack, and started packing up the camp. I didn't care how fast I was moving. I didn't care if everything got tossed into the bag haphazardly. I just wanted to leave. The fire burned low behind me, but I didn't bother with it. I needed to get out. My hands were shaking as I closed the tent and shoved it into my bag. I was already on the trail, walking as fast as I could, before I even realized what I was doing. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept walking. The trail was rough and uneven, but I moved quickly, determined to put as much distance between myself and that figure as I could. The moon was bright enough to light my way, but every shadow felt like it was hiding something, and every creak in the trees made my heart skip a beat. I don't know how far I walked before I reached the trailhead. All I knew was that I needed to get out of those woods, away from whatever or whoever had been out there. I didn't care about the hike back or the fact that I was exhausted. I just needed to be around people to feel safe. By the time I made it to my car, I was shaking. I threw my gear in the back, slammed the door, and drove off without a second thought. My mind raced, replaying the night in my head over and over again. Who was out there? What did they want? What would have happened if I hadn't decided to leave? I never did figure it out, but I never went back to that spot either. The woods were beautiful, but they held something I couldn't quite understand, something that I didn't want to risk encountering again.